Evaluating the effects of different magnitudes of reinforcement on the persistence of social skills learned through BST in adults with developmental disabilities. According to a survey by the United States Department of Labor, 64.3% of Americans living without a diagnosed disability are employed. While that may seem alarming, only 18.2% of Americans living with a diagnosed disability are employed. According to another survey by the American Institutes of Research, for every dollar an individual without a diagnosed disability makes, individuals with a diagnosed disability make 66 cents. Now, there are several reasons an employer won't hire an individual. One particular reason is that the individual may lack the social skills required for the job. Elkson & Elkson 1998 said children who fail to acquire appropriate social skills have a lower probability of completing school, becoming employed, and becoming well-adjusted adults. Huang and Kuvo 1997 determined individuals who lack appropriate social skills have greater likelihood of remaining unemployed. Mag 2005 found that an individual who lacked appropriate social skills were more likely to have a difficult time maintaining personal relationships, more likely to be rejected by peers, more likely to have a difficult time in academics, and even more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. Weiss and Harris 2001 reviewed the then current literature on social skills training. They broke up the interventions and discussed four major types of these interventions: adult-mediated interventions, peer-mediated interventions, interventions that train the individuals with autism spectrum disorders to initiate conversation, and the use of scripts. The authors noted only a few studies have been conducted teaching social skills to adolescents or adults. Harris, Henneman, and Alessandri 1990 trained 3 adolescent males to offer assistance to someone who stated that they needed help. Farmer-Dugan 1994 taught adults with autism spectrum disorder to request help when they could not complete a task using incidental teaching. One way to conceptualize teaching social skills is simply as skill acquisition. One method that has been successful for teaching individual specific skills is known as behavioral skills training, or BST. BST consists of 4 components: instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback, typically in that order. BST has been used to teach a wide variety of skills. Ward, Horner, and Stormy 2012 used the BST package to train teachers how to conduct functional analyses. Johnson et al. 2006 used the BST package to teach children child abduction prevention skills. BST has also been used to reduce inappropriate behavior. Kelso, Miltenberger, Waters, Egmohelm, and Bond 2007 used BST to reduce gunplay behavior. Silverline, Williams, and Hart 2012 used a BST package to decrease food selectivity for 3 participants. BST has been used to teach social skills. Thyman and Goldstein 2001 evaluated the effects of visual cues or instructions and video feedback on social communication. Bornstein, Bach, McFall, Freeman, and Lyons 1980 evaluated the effects of a BST package on interpersonal deficits. BST has been used to teach individuals job skills and job interview skills. Hall, Sheldon, Wildgen, and Sherman 1980 trained adults with intellectual disabilities to fill out job applications correctly and interview skills. Kelly, Wildman, and Burler 1980 used a BST package to train job interview skills to adults living in a short-term residential facility in a small group setting. Component analyses have also been conducted on the BST package. Feldman, Case, Rincover, Towns, and Bettel 1989 looked to assess the difference between all the components of the BST package and instruction only to increase a parent's affection towards her children. Kornacki, Ringdahl, Solstrom, and Nurnberger, 2013, looked to compare all the components of the BSD package for young adults with developmental disabilities training conversation skills. Results showed a different specific component correlated with the acquisition of this skill for each participant. Measuring skill acquisition during training when receiving reinforcement is important, but measuring the performance of these skills during maintenance without reinforcement has more validity, as contrived reinforcers will not likely be available following the demonstration of these skills. Measuring the response when that response is placed on extinction after the skills have been acquired is one way to measure persistence. Response persistence is the maintenance of the response during extinction. Nevin, 1974, found 3 factors that influence persistence: rate of reinforcement, magnitude of reinforcement, and the delay of reinforcement delivery. Shuttleworth and Nevin, 1965, trained pigeons to peck on a multiple schedule using different magnitudes of reinforcers and the different components. The results showed that pecking under the control of the larger magnitude of reinforcer had a greater response strength than the behavior under the control of the lower magnitude of reinforcer. Nevin, 1974, conducted a series of experiments all pertaining to the response strength. In a study assessing the effects of magnitude of reinforcement, 2 pigeons were trained in a chamber to peck on a VI 1-minute schedule when 2 independent lights were lit. When the left light was lit and the pigeons pecked, they gained access to the grains for 7.5 seconds. When the right light was lit and the pigeons pecked, they gained access to the grains for 2.5 seconds. Results showed a lower rate of responding in the presence of the green light, but more pertinent to the current study, results also showed the button paired with the high magnitude of reinforcement was more resistant to chain during extinction. The primary purpose of the present study was to evaluate the effects of different magnitudes of reinforcement on the persistence of social skills. A secondary purpose of this present study was to add to the literature and replicate the results of Nurnberger et al. 2013 showing the effectiveness of BST for teaching social skills to young adults with developmental disabilities. 3 individuals participated in the current study. All of the participants were recruited from the Evaluation and Developmental Center in Carbondale, Illinois. Kelsey was a 19-year-old female who was diagnosed with specific learning disability and had a measured IQ of 58. Lucy was a 20-year-old female who was diagnosed with a severe cognitive disability. Zeal was a 20-year-old male who was diagnosed with a learning disability not otherwise specified and had a measured IQ of 75. All sessions were conducted in a private room at EDC. The independent variable for this particular study was the implementation of the BST package. This package included instruction, modeling, rehearsal, feedback, and reinforcement. A second independent variable for this study was the specific magnitude of reinforcement that was paired with the conversation and job interview skills. Each of the skills was paired with either a low magnitude of reinforcement or high magnitude of reinforcement. The low magnitude of reinforcement was defined as access to a high preferred stimuli for 1 minute, while high magnitude of reinforcement was defined as access to the high preferred stimuli for 4 minutes. Reinforcement was delivered immediately following the conversation and job interview trials, and was only delivered after the training sessions for each skill that were at their mastery criterion, which was set at 80% of the steps correct or above. The dependent variable for this particular study was steps correct according to the task analyses. This dependent variable was reported as a percentage. The task analyses for the conversation skills was developed by Nurnberger et al. 2013. The steps on this task analysis included identifying the situation, approach, greeting, posing a question which needed to happen 3 times, waiting for a response which also needed to happen 3 times, and ending the conversation. The task analysis for job interview skills is used at EDC by the behavior consultation team. The steps for the job interview task analysis included sitting or standing at an appropriate distance, greeting, waiting for a question 3 times, responding to the question 3 times, and asking a question pertaining to the job, expressing interest in the job, and reciprocating leave taking. 2 independent observers collected data. One served as the primary data collector, and the other data collector allowed for inter-observer agreement to be measured throughout the course of this study. To calculate IOA, observers' records were compared to point-to-point correspondence for each step of the task analyses. A multiple baseline across participants with an embedded alternating treatments design was used in this study. In baseline for conversation sessions, the participants were asked to step out of the room, knock on the door, and come back in as if they were entering a room or house, and have a conversation with the experimenter. Termination criterion was set as a 4-second pause without the participant ending the conversation. For job interview sessions, the experimenter provided a job description, and participants were given a choice to read the description or have the experimenter read the description to them. After the job description was read, the participants were asked to step out of the room, knock on the door, and come back into the room as if they were entering an office. The experimenter would initiate the interview by asking a job interview question. After 3 questions, the experimenter asked the participants if they had any questions for the interviewer. The experimenter would also initiate the end of the interview by saying, "Thank you for your time. We will get back to you when a decision has been made." A vocal with 2-minute access paired stimulus preference assessment was conducted to determine the high preferred stimuli that would serve as potential reinforcers for the BST phase. Prior to implementing intervention, the participants were trained on the token exchange system. When a token with a star was delivered, they gained access to the high preferred stimuli for 4 minutes. When a token with a spade was delivered, they gained access to the high preferred stimuli for 1 minute. The intervention included the implementation of the BST package. The BST package included instruction, modeling, rehearsal, feedback, and reinforcement. The instructions were written out, and the participants were given the choice to read the instructions or have the experimenter read the instructions to them. For the modeling component, the experimenter modeled how to appropriately engage in the skills, with a second researcher acting as a conversation partner and interviewer. The rehearsal component was just like the baseline phase, except for having the feedback component follow. Feedback pertaining to the performance during the rehearsal. After feedback was delivered, a testing session was conducted, which was used to measure performance as data were collected for the course of this study. Reinforcement was delivered after the testing sessions. The low magnitude token was paired with the skill that the participant exhibited the best performance during baseline. High magnitude token was paired with the skill the participant exhibited the worst performance during baseline. For Kelsey and Lucy, the high magnitude token was paired with conversation skills. And for zeal, the high magnitude token was paired with job interview skills. Reinforcement was only delivered after testing sessions in which the participants met mastery criterion, which was set at 80% of steps correct or above. Kelsey's average performance during baseline was 11.1% of steps correct for conversation skills and 34.2% of steps correct for job interview skills. Her average performance during intervention was 77.7% of steps correct for conversation skills and 90% of steps correct during job interview skills, with an outlier in the first session. Lucy's average baseline performance for conversation skills was 8.3% of steps correct and 45.5% of steps correct for job interview skills. Lucy's average performance during intervention for conversation skills was 96.3% of steps correct and 93.9% of steps correct for job interview skills. Zeal's average performance during baseline was 60.3% of steps correct for conversation skills and 25.4% of steps correct for job interview skills. His average performance during intervention was 100% of steps correct for conversation skills and 96.9% of steps correct for job interview skills. This graph shows the percent of steps correct on conversation and job interview task analyses across participants. This graph illustrates the increase of both job interview skills and conversation skills for all participants. The results of this study showed an increase in conversation skills and job interview skills immediately after the first training session. One particularly interesting finding from this study was the immediate increase in the target behavior after the training session, despite not having yet gained access to the reinforcing stimuli. Only one of the participants, Kelsey, required more than one training session, but did not gain access to the reinforcement due to how the study was arranged, only earning reinforcement after performing the behavior at mastery criterion. These results of an immediate increase replicate the findings of Nuremberger et al. 2013 and Kornack et al. 2013. One interesting finding in Study 1 was the fact that rate of acquisition of these skills were not differentiated between high magnitude and low magnitude of reinforcement. In fact, one might be able to say that the skill paired with the high magnitude of reinforcement was acquired at a slightly slower rate due to the fact Kelsey did not meet mastery criterion after the first training session. The BST package utilized in this study differed from the typical BST package. Typically, when it comes to the rehearsal and feedback components, these steps are repeated until the participant displays behavior at mastery criterion within rehearsals, before going on to the testing session. In the current study, only one rehearsal session with feedback was utilized before moving on to the testing session, regardless of the performance during rehearsal. One possible limitation to Study 1 was the fact that it was conducted in a contrived setting. Because of how the study was arranged, the first step in the conversation task analysis, which was identifying the situation, was always scored as not applicable. Scoring this step as not applicable would reduce the total possible steps for the task analysis, which possibly could skew the data. Another limitation of this study was the lack of generalizability due to only having one conversation partner and one interviewer. Future research could investigate the number of rehearsal and feedback conditions needed to maximize effectiveness. And also future research could replicate this study, but set the conversation up as more naturalistic. Because there was no differentiation between the high magnitude and low magnitude of reinforcement in this study in terms of rate of acquisition, Study 2 focused on the persistence of these skills following mastery. All of the participants from Study 1 also participated in Study 2. Just as in Study 1, all sessions took place in a private room at EDC. There were two independent variables for this particular study. First, the different magnitudes of reinforcement, 4 minutes versus 1 minute. The reinforcement only took place during the BST sessions and were only delivered following sessions in which the participants engaged in the skills and mastery criterion. This study evaluated the effects of these magnitudes of reinforcement on the persistence of the individually paired social skills. The second independent variable in this study was time since mastery. The maintenance points that tested for persistence were collected approximately every week for 4 weeks after the last training sessions for each participant. The dependent variables for Study 2 were the same as in Study 1, and the dependent variables are in terms of percent of steps correct and also proportion to baseline. Just as in Study 1, IOA and data were collected by 2 independent observers for Study 2. The experimental design for Study 2 was an alternating treatment designed for each participant. The BST phase from Study 1 served as the baseline phase for Study 2. Maintenance was then conducted similar to the baseline session from Study 1, where no reinforcement was delivered after a mastery performance of the skill. Kelsey's average performance throughout maintenance was at 100% of steps correct for conversation skills and 84% of steps correct for job interview skills. Lucy's average performance throughout maintenance was at 100% of steps correct for conversation skills and 86.3% of steps correct for job interview skills. Zeal's average performance throughout maintenance was at 86.1% of steps correct for conversation skills and 92.9% of steps correct for job interview skills. This graph shows Kelsey's performance in baseline and maintenance on job interview skills and conversation skills in terms of percent of steps correct. This graph illustrates Lucy's performance on job interview skills and conversation skills in baseline and maintenance in terms of percent of steps correct. This graph shows Zeal's performance on job interview skills and conversation skills in baseline and maintenance in terms of percent of steps correct. The graph on the left represents Kelsey's performance during maintenance as a proportion to the baseline average, including the outlier. For her conversation skills, all sessions were at 1.28 as a proportion to the baseline average. For job interview skills, her first session was at 1.0 of the baseline average, and the last 3 sessions were at 0.89 as a proportion to the baseline average. The graph on the right shows Kelsey's performance in maintenance as a proportion to the last 3 baseline sessions, which excludes the outlier. All maintenance sessions for conversation skills were at 1.03 of the proportion to the last 3 baseline sessions. For job interview skills, the first session was at 1.0 of proportion to the last 3 baseline sessions, and the last 3 sessions were at 0.89 as a proportion to the last 3 baseline sessions. This graph shows Lucy's performance throughout maintenance as a proportion to baseline average. All maintenance sessions for her conversation skills were at 1.03 as a proportion to the baseline average. For her job interview skills, proportion to baseline average were 0.96, 0.87, 0.87, and 0.96 for the first, second, third, and fourth sessions, respectively. This graph shows Zeal's performance throughout maintenance as a proportion to the baseline average. His conversation skills sessions were 0.77, 0.66, 1.0, and 1.0 for the first, second, third, and fourth sessions, respectively. His proportion to baseline average for job interview skills were 0.93, 0.94, 1.03, and 1.03 for the first, second, third, and fourth sessions, respectively. In terms of percent of steps correct, for two of the participants, Kelsey and Lucy, the skill that had been paired with the high magnitude of reinforcement maintained at 100% throughout the maintenance phase. For these two participants, the skill that was paired with the lower magnitude of reinforcement maintained at a lower level than its high magnitude counterpart. In terms of proportion to baseline, for all participants, the skill that was paired with the higher magnitude of reinforcement maintained at a higher level than the skill that was paired with the lower magnitude of reinforcement throughout the maintenance phase. One interesting finding for this study was that there was one specific step on the job interview task analysis that all participants consistently missed during training and again during maintenance. This step was to tell the interviewer you want the job. One possible explanation for this finding is that the participants may have combined this step with the step of thanking the interviewer. Possible anecdotal evidence for this is during some of the sessions, participants said something to the effect of, "Thank you for the opportunity of talking to me." This statement combines examples of thanking the interviewer and telling the interviewer you want the job. The current study was the first known applied study to show the effects of magnitude of reinforcement on persistence. Specifically, the study showed that higher magnitudes of reinforcement leads to higher persistence of skills during maintenance. These results support and extend the findings of McComas et al. 2008. Currently, there is a plethora of research showing rate of reinforcement affects persistence. Specifically, a greater rate of reinforcement has been demonstrated to result in a relatively greater response persistence. Only a few basic and translational studies have shown magnitude of reinforcement affects response persistence, which emphasizes this study extends the current literature. The findings of the current study suggest that magnitude of reinforcement affects behavior in a similar manner to reinforcement rate. From a conceptual standpoint, these results suggest the amount of reinforcement, whether varied along the dimension of rate or the dimension of magnitude, affect response persistence. The current study is now without its limitations. One limitation to this study is a possible threat to the internal validity of testing effects. Although there were no training or reinforcement delivery in the maintenance phase, the sessions took place approximately 1 week apart. This is evidenced by the fact that neither of the skills gradually decreased throughout the maintenance phase, as was expected, which previous research has shown that the skills decrease over time. In fact, This effect was even more magnified in the results of Zeal's performance. The first 2 sessions resulted in the expected performance, higher performance for the skills paired with the higher magnitude of reinforcement, but still at a lower rate of performance during baseline. However, the last 2 sessions for both sets of skills were at 100% of steps correct. Another limitation to the current study was a limitation to study 1, which was that the generalizability of this study was never tested. Future research should add more time between maintenance sessions to decrease the likelihood of testing effects. Future research could also test for generalizability of the intervention, which can be done in a couple of ways. First, it could be more naturalistic, or you could add a novel experimenter as a conversation partner as a job interviewer. Future research could also assess the combinations of rate and magnitude of reinforcement. The current study has a few implications. First, it has implications for skill acquisition. Secondly, it has implications for the amount of reinforcement, where amount is defined as either reinforcement rate or reinforcement magnitude. One more future study could look to assess massed versus dispersed reinforcement with 2 different schedules. One schedule pairing a dense rate of reinforcement with low magnitude of reinforcement, and the second schedule would pair a lean rate of reinforcement with a high magnitude of reinforcement. Thank you for your time. Please email your comments or questions to eotte@siu.edu.